Yo, what's up, everybody? Welcome back to another video. Today we're going to be talking about Tera in doubles OU formats. This is kind of like follow-up to this post, which was like over a month ago. I know I'm hella late, but I've been really busy. And we're going to talk about this and why, I mean, this is okay for this generation, but this is objectively just like bad precedent for Spogon. So yeah, so Tera in doubles OU. It's honestly not really been that controversial, if we're being honest. Like, you might have expected that if you're coming from like VGC, that like maybe there had been like some sort of suspect or whatever for Tera and DOU, or just like at least like talk of action. I mean, that hasn't really happened. I mean, there's been like a few people over time that have like kind of complained about Tera, in like different contexts, right? Across different periods of SV. I think like it was more of a there were more people saying stuff like that like early on in SV, and later I think people kind of became resigned to the fact that like even if like it was just not going to reach the level of support, so it kind of like dropped off as a topic of contention. Although it was on like surveys for a while, it always had like, I don't know, some people like putting down on the surveys, okay, yeah, I think this is kind of dumb, but it never got over like 20% or something, if I recall correctly. It was probably even lower than that. So yeah, Tera and DOU turned out to probably be more manageable than a lot of people thought, like initially. I mean, I think this is like somewhat true across like all the Smogon formats, kind of, or maybe just every like Mons format in Gen 9. But let's be realistic here. Because Tera came after like Dynamax, it was going to have to be like twice as broken as Dynamax to get banned, realistically. And so while I think like, yeah, okay, well, it didn't get like suspected or whatever, it didn't get banned in any of the Smogon formats except Natdex. I think like a lot of that, like the quiet part that no one wants to say out loud, is the fact that like it was never going to, even if it was really broken, unless it got like because no one wanted to ban a second generational mechanic in a row, realistically. And that had a lot, I think that had like a lot more of an effect on Tyrion regarding Tera than people would care to admit, to be honest. Especially like, full disclosure, really, like, I actually don't really care like at all about either like of the last couple generational mechanics, at least in regards to the doubles. Like, I'm not a singles player, I don't give a fuck. But like in Gen 8, DOU banned Dynamax. I came along to DOU like long after that decision had been made. But I wouldn't mind like Gen 8 DOU. I'd probably actually like it better if Dynamax was legal, honestly. But like it's definitely like kind of a dumb mechanic, right? Like that it is understandable that Dynamax got banned. Like Dynamax like kind of just like broke a lot of formats, right? And Terra's doesn't have that kind of like broken like effect, you know. I mean, we talk on Swogon sometimes of like things being like broken or ban worthy in like different ways, right? I mean, Dynamax was just like the overt like too strong, whatever, right? Like your textbook broken of does too much damage, cannot knock it out, etc., etc. I mean, Terra's just like really not like that at all. Except in like there's a few things like it breaks, but that's not really a thing in doubles. Like that's more of a thing in singles, like random Tera Blasts, etc. I could definitely see how that could be like an issue in singles, but like that's never really been an issue at all in DOU. But that being said, I think like Tera is just like a cringe mechanic in my opinion. Even like if I don't have any problem with it, kind of enjoy playing with it. It's also like it's all the same, right? Like all these mechanics without that are not tied to items are going to be pretty stupid. And I mean, Tera is just like no exception, right? Like I don't know. I just think it's cringe. I think like the item-based gimmicks were just a lot more balanced. And Tera kind of like fucks with the game a little bit. But I think that's okay, you know. Like these mechanics are designed to like change the game. And like even if they're like objectively like broken compared to like you know previous like generations or whatever. I don't don't have an issue with it. I mean, I know like that's not really like an argument that like a lot of people would like accept, as like valid or whatever. But I think like personally, I just don't really care because like it's still Pokemon. I mean, uh, you can get enjoyment out of like basically any format ever for like a limited amount of time. That's something I've learned over my time playing this game. But yeah, so that's kind of, I digress. Anyways, but so about a month ago, they made the announcement that Tera was not going to be allowed to be like suspected in like any of the official formats. The logic being used here was like, okay, there's not enough time left in the generation to do this to make such a substantial change. And I mean, I guess like fair enough, right? Like, I kind of get it. Gen 10 is probably coming in like late 2026. I don't think it's going to come in 2025. But and I mean, with like a lot of the latest like news and stuff about like Pokemon Champions, who knows even like how precedent is going to work for like Showdown or Smogon going forward? There's a lot of stuff up in the air. I mean, this was made before all that. This was like a week or so before all those announcements. So yeah, I mean, like, there's not a whole lot of time left, et cetera, et cetera. Like, we don't want to like ban the generational mechanic, whatever. I mean, that's like fair enough. I think like that's kind of a bit of a cop out. Maybe that's like more of an issue with these like tiers that have like had nonstop like arguments about this shit, and like you want to put it to rest. But I mean, doubles hasn't really been like that, and so it kind of leaves a bad taste in my mouth that this kind of thing is like taken off the table. Even if like the reasoning here is like okay, like objectively going forward, I don't think like what OU does should have much of an effect on what like DOU does. And I think it's a bit strange that these like the argument of precedent is used all the time on Smogon. It's like kind of cringe, right? But yeah, like we can't ban we have to ban Tatsugiri instead of Commander because of precedent. Like, what if people try to start banning abilities? We can't set that precedent. Well, yeah, now all of a sudden you're okay just like saying that whatever OU decides applies to the rest of the lower tiers, right? Like, that's like an actual precedent that you're setting, and not just like some slippery slope argument, right? Like, I just think it's bizarre that this decision was applied to like all the tiers, especially considering like there's a lot more time left in the generation like when these people were acting like there were. So again, not really much. I'm not like really upset about it. I just think like definitely like raised an eyebrow for me. Like I was just like, all right, man, like sure, like but it is what it is, right? Like I'm not upset about this in this context, but what I don't want to see is like in a few years, like there's another generational mechanic that's like, say it's slightly more broken in doubles than it is in singles, right? Like we haven't had a mechanic like that yet because things like break in singles a lot easier than they do in doubles in general. There's a lot more ways to play around things when you have two Pokemon at the field at all times. But that's not to say like hypothetically there couldn't be a mechanic, right, where like it's more of an issue in doubles than singles. It could be like really controversial, and I think this precedent like scares me a little bit because like what if we get like halfway through the gen or whatever like we did here, and like upper staff on Smogon decide, well, okay, like it's been too long, we're not going to suspect Tera. Like what if this mechanic is like I don't know, it leaves a bad taste in my mouth that this decision was kind of made for all the lower tiers, and like especially for like DOU, even though in like DOU it's even less of an issue with Tera than it is in singles, right? Like again, not an issue now, could be an issue later, probably still won't be an issue later, but just a little bit of a questionable decision. I just wanted to get that out of the way first, because these generational mechanics, like I'm not sure if they're ever going to stop adding them. We could see a lot of different iterations of this over the years. And I think making like a hard decision like this might not age well, I don't know. But regardless, Tera and DOU has been relatively uncontroversial compared to like to singles. But I think the more interesting perspective here is like maybe like a bit of a comparison to like VGC, right? So VGC obviously has had a much different experience with like Tera than like DOU has, because VGC has been like open team sheet since like they're like a month into the gen, and that like gives like a much different like experience of playing around Tera when you know what your opponent's Tera is and like all their options and stuff. And so like you might expect like if you've played like VGC, which I mean VGC is like a little bit more of a volatile format anyways, just because there's less mons. It's faster paced and stuff, but like you might expect that without OTS would be more of an issue, but it actually like probably hasn't been. The main discussions around Tera and like DOU were more of like a few people, like such as myself, thought it would be cool to have like Tera preview, or at least like have like a mini tour where that was a thing, and that would have been really cool. I think we had a couple room tours with that. I actually rather liked playing those room tours. I thought it was really fun, and probably like better than like what we have. But like it'd be such a major change, you know, and like a lot of people felt like it just really wasn't necessary because we never had like too much of an issue with Tera to begin with. I mean, with that being said, I think in conjunction with another video I plan on recording later today, I think like what I want to do here is like take a look back at some of the things that got banned from DOU and like how Tera impacted them and how like, you know, how things could have been different if we had like taken action on Tera. I don't think anything really majorly would change. But this is kind of more of just like a fun look back at like Tera in the format and how it really has affected things. You know, this is a very powerful mechanic. You get to see this in Nat decks, right? Playing a lot of Nat decks, DOU has given me like I think like some insight that I probably would not have had if I like had just played SV, right? And one of those insights is that Tera is actually the strongest generational mechanic of any of the ones that were ever introduced, right? And what do I mean by that? What I mean is like in Nat decks, megas are like really strong still, right? Like there's some megas that are really good. You want them on your mons, right? But a lot of the time, it's like really more important to like have like good like mons that can like Tera, like take a lot of advantage of Tera, because that like flexibility of having it on like all your mons that don't have a Megastone or a Z Crystal is really powerful, and getting rid of like your option to Tera early on in the game is like a very big detriment. And so even in like a format like Nat decks that has like Z moves and Megas, like Tera is a bigger consideration in those games than like Z moves or Megas. Except in some cases, I mean, like there's some edge cases where there's some weird Z moves that can like completely disrupt a game, right? But most of those are not particularly good. Like Komodo's Z move is like not very good because it would rather Tera. A lot of mons just like don't hold Z Crystal because they would rather Tera. That's not really an issue for the Megas, but because we only really use the Megas that are really good anyways. Like Mega Salamence is better than Salamence with Tera. Like that's not really like a debate or whatever, but Tera is just a more powerful mechanic and more game changing than either of those two. I think Mega Evolution has like a bit of more like it affects like how you like build around your teams a little bit more. But like in game, like Tera is like the biggest consideration that you have to make on any given turn in Nat decks. And for that reason, I consider Tera to be like a stronger mechanic than the other two. So yeah, I mean, it's had like objectively, it's had broad implications on DOU. So I guess we'll just like go into the archive here and like talk about the stuff that was banned. The first things that were banned were Bafatel and Fluttermane and Tatsugiri. Fluttermane has a long and storied history in DOU. That's his own video. But Tatsugiri / Commander / Dondozo, that was not really an issue of Tera, except it actually kind of was. So one like I can't really show any replays for this because they're all like dead because of the replay destruction. But let's see. Yeah, Shadow Tag, I mean, that was kind of, I just uploaded the video on that in Natfix. That was, like, not really controversial in DOU at the time. Like, just these, like, off tiltings of, like, King Wu, and we're just, like, completely stupid. And it was such a miserable experience that Shadow Tag never got tested again in DOU. But the thing with Dondozo / Tatsugiri, at least that I remember it, was, like, it was objectively uncompetitive, like, even, like, without Tera, like, a little bit, right? Because it's just a very, like, strong mechanic. But the fact that it Tera was really, in my opinion, what made it so uncompetitive. And this is not really like a case of, oh my gosh, we should have banned Tera instead of Dondozo or Tatsugiri or whatever. Like, no, I mean, it would not have been, like, fun to have in the tier anyways. But the problem was, right? Let's think about it in the context of the interaction between Dondozo and Amoonguss. So, Dondozo was able to use just a complete variety of Tera types, right? So, early on, I mean, the thing that people were exploring to counter Dondozo, right, was mainly, like, clearing its stats with, like, Haze or Clear Smog. So, the problem with that was Haze was not really on good Pokemon. Like, it's on, like, Palafin and Shenpao and, like, a few other things. Oh, it's like Murkrow was, like, the main one. But, like, it's just not exactly the greatest thing in the world to have to use Haze. It was, like, okay on Murkrow, but, like, we quickly realized that Murkrow was, like, actually, like, not that good in DOU. So the main thing became Clear Smog Amoonguss. So Clear Smog Amoonguss was, like, one of the best counters to Amoonguss, or not to Amoonguss, to Dondozo for, like, the first, like, week that we really had, like, Gen 9. Like, you just Clear Smog it, go away. But the problem with that was, I mean, people obviously quickly realized that, well, if I change my Dondozo to a Steel type, I can't be Clear Smogged, right? And that was really, really silly. And so, yeah, there were a couple games where Dondozo did that. We were like, alright, well, okay, we're just gonna spore the Dondozo first. But the problem was, Dondozo could hold safety goggles. So Tera turned Dondozo from something that was, like, easily checked by Amoonguss, something that was not checked at all in DOU, especially with the lack of open team field. Like, Amoonguss is, like, really good into, like, Dondozo just in general, and, like, BGC. But, like, a lot of that, it's really helpful in, like, BGC when you, like, just know, like, what the Dondozo's options are on any given turn. And DOU just didn't know that. And so that made that interaction in particular really cursed. That was the main thing with Dondozo. Again, extremely silly Pokemon that I'm very glad we had banned, even with, like, not considering Tera, just because, like, it was just stupid to deal with. I'm glad we never, like, really retested that, because it probably just would have caused more problems than it was worth. So that was the thing with Dondozo. Now for Flutter, Flutter is a really, really interesting case. Flutter shed some light onto, like, the conditions that are required for Tera to, like, really affect a mon. Or, I don't know if I'm putting this the right way. What I mean to say is, like, every time we've had a Pokemon in DOU that could reliably transform into, like, one of its stab types with Tera, and that was, like, its best set, that Pokemon ended up being broken. The clearest example of this is with Flutter. Flutter could just, like, Tera Fairy, like, all the time, with Dazzling Gleam. This was an issue, like, throughout all the times it was legal. There was an issue at the beginning with, like Chi-Yu Flutter, like Tera Fairy D-Gleam was just broken. Tera Fairy Moonblast was just broken. In, like, pre-home, that was, like, particularly egregious. Like, there was just, like, no argument that was, like, should have been legal at all. And when it got freed again, like, Specs Tera Fairy D-Gleam was still, like, in my opinion, the strongest set. That's the set that ended up getting it rebanned eventually. And Flutter has a really interesting interaction with Tera, because its typing is just so great offensively, and Fairy is just such a great type. And Tera into a Fairy type, like, actually had some defensive value as well. And so Flutter's best Tera was just a Tera that just like made it do infinite damage. And that was kind of dumb. Um, there's not a whole lot of examples in mods like that. Because a lot of the stuff wasn't like broken in like that level of just outright offensive power. But another thing was like Basque. Like you could see like Tera Ghost Basque. That was just a good set. Another example. This is less true now. But like at the time when like Ursulina released, the thing that everyone used on it was like Tera Normal with Tera Normal Facade. And like at the time we just like didn't know how to play around it. We didn't have a whole lot of options in the game that were really good at it. But like once like Rillaboom got Glide and a few other things were added, like Ursulina got freed and there's never been a problem since. But it turns out we realized that like Tera Normal is just not the best Tera type anyway. It just gets better value out of a defensive Tera because it needs that. But in that brief period of time when it was allowed to just use Tera Normal, it was really dumb. Like you just click Facade into everything, into Trick Room, and everything died. Am I missing anything? What are the other bands we had in DOU? Oh, Deoxys Attack. Best Tera was Tera Psychic. So this is the point I'm getting at here, right? Like when a mon was able to every time a mon was reliably able to always spam its stab typing as a Tera type in DOU, it usually ended up being broken. Is this correlation or causation? I'm really not sure. I think it might, and I think it's probably causation, to be honest. Like the mons that were able to like get away with that, were just so overwhelmingly powerful anyway that like it didn't matter like if they had a defensive profile, because usually in like doubles formats, as opposed to singles where this is less true, maybe a little bit less true. I think it's still true, but what do I know? Like defensive value for your Tera or like a defensive typing is usually better 99% of the time, and that's why these Pokemon that were able to just completely ignore that and just spam offensive Teras anyway into their stab typing. That's why those Pokemon have just been like really, really dumb. I guess the one exception to that is like King Gambit. Always like looks like Tera Dark. But it's a more of a unique case where the Steel typing actually really doesn't benefit it that much and actually drops a lot of its weaknesses when it Teras into Dark. Which I mean, some of those other examples did too. But King Gambit is still, at some points, been one of the strongest Pokemon in the tier, and also runs other Tera types more than the other Pokemon did. So yeah, every time a Pokemon has like been able to reliably Tera into one of the stab types, it's been kind of broken. And so that is one way Tera kind of like affected Mons. And those Mons, it's worth noting, while Tera was like really good for them, those Pokemon would have been broken in a Tera-less metagame anyway. I think, like, without a doubt, all of them. And so that's kind of like the category of Mons that like Tera just like augmented, but didn't really affect whether they were broken or not, right? Like it just made them more broken. They already were. And so that's the main thing with Flutter, DOA, and like other stuff. And so, what was the next thing after? I guess the next thing that was on that got banned was Annihilate. So Annihilate is probably one of the most interesting DOU bans when it comes to this topic. Let's see. Oh, I forgot there was like a Flutter resuspect. Let's see. Yeah, here it is. So Annihilate was obviously really good because of like Rage Fist, right? In VGC, Annihilate has always been like a really good mon and has like had a lot of success, but it was never quite like as dumb as it was in DOU. Because in DOU, like Pokemon like Annihilate that are like really strong in win conditions, like setup win conditions. If the Pokemon is sufficiently like strong enough, you can like dedicate your entire team to using Annihilate, right? So we saw teams that were like entirely revolving around setting up Annihilate or like maybe one other win condition. There was like a famous Rabska team that like Amaranth was using. I used Annihilate with like Stantler screens and stuff, and so you could just like stack all these things that made Annihilate better on the same team. And it was just really dumb. And I mean, obviously the offensive type coverage was like really good as well. Like you just can't resist fighting Ghost in general. But obviously Rage Fist was dumb. And so it's a bit of a gray area, right? Because while all these things are true, while Annihilate would have been really, really strong in DOU without Tera anyways, without a doubt, one of the things that was dumbest about it was the fact that it could... The intersection of its abilities and Tera. What do I mean by that? So, Annihilate had many viable Tera options. Like, I'm not even sure, like, we explored, like, all of them in the time it was legal. But the main ones were, like, Water, Fire, Grass, and... I don't think we ever used Dragon. We probably would use Dragon nowadays without Flutter around. I think Poison was also used a few times. Fairy was, like, okay. And, like, all these different Tera types all did different things. So the counterplay to Annihilate was so dependent on, like, what Tera type it had, and the fact that you didn't know it was maybe the thing that, like, convinced the most people that Tera was broken of anything that we've ever had, if I had to guess, right? Because it certainly felt like it was broken to me at that time, at least. But I also knew that it was mainly an Annihilate issue. But, okay, so the counterplay to Annihilate was interesting, right? So, at first, one of the best things you could do to cripple Annihilate was to burn it, right? With Wisp. Mods like Arcanine and stuff. The problem is, for one, Arcanine activates Defiant with Intimidate. And problem two, Annihilate very quickly started to use Tera Fire, right? So all of a sudden, you had to contend with Annihilate that were Tera Water, which was, I think, the first Tera type that people really spammed, and then Tera Fire to ignore the burn, right? And so that had some like really solid success. I think Fire was like probably the most. Are any of these replays around? No, unfortunate. It'd be really nice if I had evidence of any of these things that happened early on in the metagame. But yeah, Tera Fire was like one of the main things, right? Another Pokemon that's really, really good into Annihilate is Amoonguss. Similar situation to Dozo, right? Clear Smog, Spore, Rage Powder. So, I mean, obviously that was a thing, but Annihilate could just, again, it could be Tera Steel, or it could be Tera Steel, or it could be like Tera Grass, to neglect like those two things. But with Annihilate, what was really toxic was Annihilate got to do more of those things at once, because Annihilate's other ability, which doesn't really see a whole lot of usage in VGC, because Defiant's just like really good, is Vital Spirit. And so Annihilate was able to like simultaneously cover like Spore, and like Clear Smog if it wanted to be like Tera Steel. I don't think Tera Steel is like particularly common or anything. I think that was more of like a Dondozo thing. But it could be Vital Spirit, or it could be Tera Grass. Like there was two ways it could dodge Spore, and almost every Annihilate between Vital Spirit, Safety Goggles, and Tera Grass had a way to dodge Spore. So Amoonguss was not a counter. Except when we started running Toxic Amoonguss. And Toxic Amoonguss was actually the best Annihilate counter in the game. It was like that was the one way you could like consistently beat Annihilate. But I think if we had given it enough time, I bet Annihilate would have started running Tera Poison, and that would have been an issue either. Honestly, I'm surprised we didn't run that. I think it was just like not around for long enough for us to reach that point. But yeah, a Toxic Amoonguss was like probably the best counter there was to Annihilate. Because it was difficult for Annihilate to remove Amoonguss in general. But there were obviously still ways you could protect your Annihilate. So, yeah, Annihilate was just really dumb. It had too many options. Like, between the item slot, Tera, and the ability, Annihilate was able to cover almost everything it wanted at once. And Tera was a big part of that. Like, between the item and the ability, yeah, it was able to cover stuff, right? But with Tera, it was able to, like, greed stuff like leftovers and not have to run Safety Goggles. So, yeah, I mean, Annihilate was definitely pushed over the edge by Tera. lot of its issues are just due to Annihilate being dumb as a Pokemon, but I think without Tera, like, it would have had a much more compelling case to be legal. And this was kind of like the last. This is one of the ones that Tera really affected like the most. Yeah, this Pokemon is just insane. It's just hilarious thinking about it. I love this metagame though. It was just hilarious. Like, what do you mean my Amogus was toxic and it's the best move on it? Okay, so after Annihilate, the next thing that got suspected was Iron Hands. So Iron Hands did not get banned, full disclosure. / spoiler. Iron Hands was maybe one of the strongest Pokemon in pre-home. There was a lot of dumb things. I think Iron Hands probably should have been banned realistically. It was really dumb. But it was part of what made it dumb was Tera. But I think it was more of like a limited dex thing, you know. In this metagame, like Hands was able to just like run SD, and it was just really stupid. But yeah, Iron Hands was another mon that just made broad usage out of many different Tera types, and it was just kind of like, let's see, Terastallization in Iron Hands. Oh, that's a good post. One of DOU's greatest posters. Tera might be worth reviewing post-home, but I'm not sold it really matters that much in Iron Hands' case. A well-timed Tera will bail Iron Hands out of a rush of matchups, but it still snowballs in plenty of games where it never Teras as well. I think without Tera in the picture, Iron Hands would win the same set and cause the same problems. I agree. At worst, it might have to make some small concessions, like running safety goggles for Amogus, and players will have to cover its fighting electric weaknesses more responsibility in the builder. Yeah, I think this is a fair take. Yeah, this actually covers a lot of the same stuff. I think I do disagree a little bit. I think Tera was, in pre-home in particular, was like a little bit more influential for Iron Hands, but I think the general gist of this post is important. Like, this was just a limited dex thing, right? And the mons that were strong with Tera, or arguably push it over the edge, was, like, whatever, you know? Let's see. Damn, this was kind of a controversial suspect. But yeah, that was Iron Hands. It stayed legal anyways, and I don't know why I'm discussing it. And then, okay, pre-home. Oh, I forgot the two biggest examples of could Tera into their Slime type were really stupid. The two Urshifus, that was just not okay. Tera just absolutely made those mons dumb, but I think those Pokemon are just inherently stupid, right? Like, Unseen Fist, but look at, I mean, like, Water Shifu is, like, fully legal, in Gen 8 DOU. Dark Shifu is not, kind of a complicated history there between those two, but, like, Water Shifu lasted, like, 2 weeks, and then we realized Tera Water just broke the Pokemon, and it never was legal again. So yeah, that's a good example. I already talked about Ursaluna. I guess I already talked about the rest of them. Except for Arcaludon. Arcaludon is probably the last really good example, kind of like Annihilate, that puts the fact that Tera might be an issue, like, on the table, right? Arcaludon, demonstrably, in my opinion, would not be nearly as much as an issue without Tera. Tera was so huge for this Pokemon. So, for context, Annihilate actually just got banned, like, a couple months ago. And Arcaludon, just like Annihilate, had teams built around it. Like, not quite to the same degree. Annihilate kind of, like, had all these, like, Greens teams that were, like, solo win conning Annihilate. Arcaludon was on rain teams that had, like, other win conditions as well. Like Kingdra or, like, Basque Legion female. But Arcaludon's was so stupid because you could preserve all your Counterplay to the Mon for the entire game, and like, that would be okay, right? Like, if it didn't have Tera. But the problem was, it was a lot more difficult to preserve counters to Arcaludon before and after Tera. So Arcaludon was one of the toughest Pokemon to, like, cover for, in terms of, like, planning out, like, your game plan, like, on preview. because it's very difficult to preserve. It's hard enough to preserve like one like resource, right? Like it's hard enough to preserve like your Lando Eye into a rain team. Uh, but it's even harder to preserve both the Lando Eye for like if they annihilate, not they annihilate, the Archaludon doesn't Tera, and even harder to like preserve like your Tera so you can break it with like your Tera Poison Lando or whatever, or whatever else you wanna break it with. Like you could annihilate. Not why do I keep confusing annihilate and Archaludon? But Archaludon's like main Tera types I think were like grass, bug, and fairy. Mostly fairy, because of Regidrago, right? Like Regidrago was like a great counter to Archaludon, but all of a sudden like people kind of picked up on that and started running Tera Fairy. Which like kind of like just eliminated Regidrago's counterplay in general. I mean, wasn't a perfect solution because a lot of those Regidrago teams also run Goldango, and Tera Fairy demonstrably makes you worse into Goldango. But Tera was still huge for this Pokemon. And I think it was uncompetitive in general, right? And I think really for me, like there's been a few Pokemon, that like Annihilate and Archaludon that Tera like made more broken and probably pushed a little bit over the edge. It's hard to know because we don't have like formats without Tera to really test it with. But I think I would have not voted ban. I don't think I would have voted ban on either of these mons if it weren't for Tera. It's just so much easier to take advantage. And so this is a different kind of mon that like gets broken by Tera. These Pokemon do not, or probably have less of a use case, or not less of a use case, less of like a case to be banned in a Tera-less metagame. But Tera, they're defensive Tera types, and like the variety of options that they can be, while like you don't actually know what their Tera type is, are just enough that like it makes the counterplay to a Pokemon like this like very difficult. And so yeah, I mean like this is kind of like the main thing like I would find issue with Tera, right? But the reason why this is not a deal breaker for me in regards to Tera is even though like it's a little bit difficult when you don't know exactly what Tera your opponent's running. Because like all the Smogon formats are like CTS and don't have like Open Tera. That's kind of why I was like interested in Open Tera. But the thing is, even like in a format without Open Tera, like it was still mostly okay. And we very rarely, like I don't even know if I can point to a specific example where like a surprise Tera type like won a major tournament game. Like I mean, it's definitely like happened before, like in like less important games or whatever. But I think like by and large, it was just more consistent to run the good Tera types at all times. Because Tera is just that powerful. And so Tera was so powerful that like the good Tera types were almost always worth running more, because why would you waste your Tera on like Tera Fire Archaludon, man? Like, like or like it, the fact that Tera gives you so much value means that it's not a good decision in the builder to put Tera types on your mon that are only good for like one specific hyper-specific matchup. Even if like you know what your opponent is running, like having the option to like Tera into a good type is much better than having the option to Tera into a gimmicky type that is gonna like make people upset and be like, oh my god, ran Tera, And that's really the reason why I think like Tera is relatively uncontroversial, because we just like, even with the fact that Pokemon can be all these defensive Tera types, you can have a better idea of like what exactly the Tera is than like you might think, And I think that's really that was like a little bit predictable. I mean, I saw people saying that like very early on into SV and even before SV, but that's really at the end of the day what makes Tera like okay, The fact that the opportunity cost of like that forces you to basically run good Tera types, that actually makes counterplay of these Pokemon much easier, And that's a thing that's really cool about it. But yeah, I mean, They're the Archaludons, the Annihilates of the world, but at the end of the day, there's also like uh, Pokemon that like take good advantage of Tera. Like in Archaludon's case, right? Like Lando Eye was a counter before Tera, but the fact that it could run like Tera Poison and like run like Sludge Bomb into like the common Tera types after Tera, like that was really cool. Even if Archaludon was broken, right? Like, um, in some cases, it actually makes defensive counterplay a little bit easier. And yeah, I think I don't really know if I have anything much else to say. That's kind of just an overview of like what Tera has done overall. We'll look through a team builder. Oh, the other thing is like the Ogre Pawns, right? Actually, I have more to say. The Ogre Pawns are like a really interesting use case. When they all get extraordinary value out of Tera, obviously, because like they get that stat boost. I think that's really cool. Ogerpon is one of the coolest designed Pokemon we've ever had. I think Ogerpon is one of the best examples of like the good stuff they've done with Tera. Like this Pokemon in doubles formats has been really, really cool. Especially Wellspring with such a unique typing. We don't have water types. This Pokemon, by and large, saved multiple DOU formats. Because of the fact it had like a really cool Tera, it had Follow Me and stuff like that. So the Ogerpons are a really good example. We need more Ogerpons. Like Ogerpon is just one of the best competitive Pokemon ever designed, in my opinion. I don't know how it's going to be like without Tera in like the next game or whatever, but Ogerpon's an example of like cool Tera stuff. Other cool Tera stuff, right? Even just on this team, right? Like we have like Tera Fairy Heatran, like Pokemon with immunity abilities have always been really cool at Tera and DOU, and NVGC as well. But the thing is, all these Pokemon at most usually have 3 or 4 Tera types. There's a few Pokemon that are exceptions, right? So the one issue I will say I have with Tera is Tera makes some hyper offensive archetypes a little bit better, and that's a little bit cringe. Powknight, for one. I mean, we have multiple examples on this same team. This is... I mean, I've spent a fair amount of time of my life complaining about Powknight in the past. It's really not worth it. But, you know, Tera Normal, D-Knight, Extreme Speed, very dumb. Big damage number. And so there's a few things you can do with that, but that's always telegraphed. Like, you know on preview that's what it is. 99% of the time, right? Unless it's like the odd scale shot D-Knight. And so the stuff that's really good, you know, like it's only good when it's one specific Tera. So like, you know in advance that these offensive Tera types, like you can like play around them better, and that's really what I think makes Tera like playable. However, unfortunately, the one issue I will say I have with Tera in DOU is Hard Trick Room. Hard Trick Room has always been like kind of like Full Room has always been like an archetype in DOU to varying degrees of success. Like there's an SM Full Room sample, there's a Gen 8 Full Room sample, but unfortunately with Tera there's a few Trick Room setters that just use Tera a little bit too much, and I think it's not like these archetypes are like broken or anything, but it's made them a lot stronger and a lot more like they're a lot more of something you have to like actually respect than I think they probably should have been, and that's the main issue I'll say I have with Tera, at least in like the current iteration of DOU. And the main fixture of that is DNC. DNC they did a really good job actually. This is something I'll talk about this a little bit. They did a really good job of the stuff they let into SV in general. Like they did a really good job. Like except for like Urshifu, you know, which, I mean, it came out in Gen 8, so it was kind of like obviously going to be in this game. They really like to have like the Pokemon that came out in the previous gen in the next game. And that's something like I've noticed in the past. Aside from like Urshifu, like they did a really good job cutting things. Like they didn't want to have like Tapu Koko in the game with like Quark Drive and stuff, and with Tera. They didn't want to have like the Ultra Beast in the game with Tera. Like Stakataka, like Natdex. Oh my god. Like, you know, Tapu Fini with Tera, also a little bit toxic, even if it would have been like really good for the game, and I wish they had added Tapu Fini. Like it would have been really strong. So they cut out a lot of mons that like really abuse Tera. However, there's one Pokemon that feels like an oversight, and that's DNC. This Pokemon should not have access to Tera. It's a little bit held back because like offensively, it can't really break Goldingo, and so like as a metagame condition, that's actually pretty good at like keeping the NC in check, and also like Lando is good into it before and after Tera. But aside from Goldingo and Lando I, the NC basically beats every mon in the tier if you could factor in Tera, um, because it beats almost all the physical attackers. And once it gets like a Diamond Storm boost, because once it gets a Diamond Storm boost, like it kind of just beats them. And so what Tera does with Trick Room setters is that it allows mons in a closed team sheet format, specifically in closed team sheet. I don't think this is an issue in BGC, but it's a lot more impactful when the decision of whether or not the Pokemon Tera types or like what Tera type it is, when the mon like when the mon living doesn't just like click an attack, when it clicks like a field condition that affects the game for the next 5 turns, right? And so what Tera does is something like Diancie, especially a mon like Diancie that has multiple like things it could Tera into. It could be all of fire, water, grass, and dragon. And so in a closed team sheet format, when you don't know what one of them is, a mon like Terrain into one of those types, it's very difficult to cover all of them, even if you know like those are like what the options are. It's still not infeasible because like you can like position well around like some of your like strong offensive mons, and like with type coverage you can like try to factor in at the very least like really large damage on DNC. But then if you like take into account like redirection or something, it becomes very, very difficult to stock Trick Room, especially for some teams. And so I think it's like really increased like the level of like preparation required to beat some of these full room teams in a way that I don't think is particularly healthy. It becomes a lot easier to set up Trick Room with Tera, and that one Trick Room could be the difference, or like getting up a second Trick Room or not can be like the main difference if these like full Trick Room teams win, because like Trick Room's always going to go up once. That's always kind of been the case, unless you have like the perfect taunt lead or something. But the variability on like what the DNC can Tera into, or what the Hoopa can Tera into, or what the Indeedee can Tera into, that really, I think, negatively impacts the game. I think like probably not as big a deal in BGC, like when you like actually know what the options are. And they also don't have to worry about DNC as well. Like this is the strongest Trick Room setter ever. Except for I guess like Stack Attack and Nat decks, but like in terms of like setting its Trick Room and like capitalizing on its own Trick Room offensively, this is unparalleled in what it does. But yeah, I think, and I mean I think they kind of just messed up with full room in general this gen, I guess, because like the Indeedee female just shouldn't have Trick Room like that. That was just like egregious. It was really good when it didn't have it. That was like one of the best things about the mod. But the fact that it could like set Trick Room and quick redirection is another issue. But I think Tera is a bigger one. And I think that's my one issue with Tera. Like, full room is much better, I think, than it would be otherwise. And particularly with DNC. It's less of an issue with some of the other mods, but the mod like DNC is so bulky, and like it can completely flip like what answers it because of its stats. And the fact that like Rock is such an excellent typing. Anyway, there's a lot of things going into this, but I think Tera definitely negatively impacts the game in regards to like full room. But I don't think it's like that big of an issue to the point where like it was ever going to need to be rectified with like a Tera ban or something, right? Like moves like taunt, like fake out cycling, like that's all stuff that's still good into these Trick Room teams, like regardless of the fact they have access to Tera. So it's okay. But definitely made an archetype that's not one of the healthiest archetypes in the game better than it probably otherwise should have been. And I think that's kind of regrettable. But, at the cost, taking that as the cost, while having so many other benefits for the game, that's okay, But, yeah, I think that's mostly it. Let me just go over my build here a little bit more. More counterplay to Momungus. That's a good thing about Tera. Especially considering they removed Beanie. Like, Tera Grass is one of the coolest things in doubles that they've had. Oh yeah, mons like Spectre that like get access to coverage, not as big of a deal. Ignore this team sucks. But Like we've seen like Spectre with like Specs Tera Blast. That's really the one mon that's been able to like take advantage of Tera in doubles. With Tera Blast. In singles, that's a much bigger issue, but a lot of these Pokemon have other issues holding them back in doubles, and like you don't want to use your Tera offensively a lot of the time, as I went into earlier. And so, you know, that's kind of the thing with a model like Spectre or Regieleki. Like they don't benefit quite as much as like you'd expect, and like if we're coming from a singles perspective. What else? Such a deep talking. I can't even like really go into all the stuff. And also like the dynamic between mons that want a Tera and mons that don't is really interesting. Like Incineroar, like if you're Terraing your Incineroar or Amoonguss, you probably lost the game. More of a thing for Amoonguss than it is for Incin, but like every time I've seen a Amoonguss Tera, like it has literally like lost the game. I think except for like maybe a few times. There's probably more of an issue when like Amoonguss was more common, but like there'd be situations where like you'd have to Tera Amoonguss, but then your Amoonguss like ended up getting spored, so it was like kind of quick. But yeah, the funniest shit is like Terraing the Amoonguss, but then the opposing Amoonguss can redirect the spore with range powder. But yeah, I think that's mostly it. But again, so Terra's like been like obviously a really important part of DOU this gen. But I hope this was an interesting video. I kind of just wanted to talk about it a little bit, and broadly, I wanted to talk about like how this affects DOU going forward. Again, like I said, this is not an issue for this gen. Like that's kind of just what I went into, right? Like Terra's pretty cool in most cases, but I think like taking away like the autonomy from various tiers is just not good precedent. That's why I haha the post. A little bit toxic, but like going forward, maybe not the greatest thing in the world. But yeah, that's it. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you very soon for the next video.